the train slowed as its large mass rolled into the station. The wooden platform seemed to have undergone no renovation or rejuvenation since its construction, leaving the place with a waning feel to every forgotten piece of architecture. Wood creaked under my feet as I moved across the platform at a brisk pace. My dress flared behind me as the wind caught hold of it. I made little pleasantries with the man at the ticket counter before I was on the cobblestone of the town's main street. Unlike the complex roadways that featured all modes of traffic from trams to bikes of Amthrara or some, these roads seemed formed by randomly cut stone with shaven tops dug into the dirt. It's not the best to walk on at the very least, but at least it is made by some level of stonecutter class. Gazing down the street, I searched for any car I could acquire to get a ride to my location. Unfortunately, I only spotted a few models that looked closer to the horse-drawn versions of days long since past than actual automobiles driven in more civilized parts of the empire. Making my way into a building across the street from the station, I plunged into my dress pocket in search of my identification as I approached the check-in desk of the town's magical registry office. "Identification, please," a bearded older man said in a monotone flat voice, which would have fit better on some engineer's automaton than any human or elven man. "Amelie Fishclaw, Grass Mage level 23, Kinelovia scale level 5, I stated, exasperated as I handed over my document. The man took a second to look through each paper before flicking to the next. Finally, at the final page, he lifted a black pen from his desk and flicked it in one smooth, instantaneous motion, signing the paper with his signature and the signature of the town before passing it back to me. The dull look on his face told me he put no real effort into the procedure. At least, nothing to be impressed by. However, I was still in a tiny bit of awe at the man's speed. I ponder the man as I leave the building. Probably some secretariat class or maybe a lawyer? No, a lawyer would have left this hovel long ago, especially in this backwater of the country. Still looking for a way to get where I need to be, I look around more. The main street is lined with the railway on one side while shops and businesses line the other. There's a small bridge a little further down the road, meaning there is most likely a small stream or river down that way. The town's isolation means it was most likely formed as a place for farmers to deposit their goods to sell to other towns, back when the railway line was a merchant's road. While stewing on how a town like this came to be, I used my magic to pick a weed from one of the many cracks in the pavement. The small green thing had a singular red bloom at its top, identifying it as some type of gerundial, but the specifics didn't matter. I slowly moved the leaves, roots, and stem into a little weaved basket or bowl, with the flower bulb adorning its side like a pendant or button. A familiar voice calling for me knocked me out of my creation. "Amelie! You trying to find a way to the place?" Roderick, a level 2 flame mage, asked. As a low-level mage, Roderick was a lower Kinelovia scale level than me, being a 6. Level 1 would be one of the most powerful weavers in the Empire, able to do significant damage to a major city before becoming tired. At the same time, a Kinelovia scale level 15 is the most inept 16-year-old caster at any academy. I suspected Roderick was on the cusp of becoming a flame mage the last time I saw him 2 months ago, so it was good to see he got that advancement. Roderick was not alone, however. He had another man by his side who I knew of as Backnop. I hadn't talked to the man often, but from what I remember, he was a level 28 or 9 metal mage with the same Kinelovia scale level as me. Accompanying the two men was a woman I hadn't seen before. She had an air of ferocity to her that was hard to understand. So I spoke. "Rod, Buck, it's good to see you're in the same vehicular situation as me. Though what I don't understand is why the 4 of us are out in the backwater area of the Empire," I asked the two men as I tried to ignore the woman who gave a shallow cough to gain my attention. "Oh, sorry I didn't see you before." "You are?" I gave my fake apology to the woman, who seemed neither angry at my bypassing her nor at my question. "I am Paula Junkley, level 3, Stone Weaver Kinelovia scale level 4. And my boss is the one that brought the 4 of us here to the middle of nowhere without telling us why, except that it was important," Paula answered, and my face fell. A weaver, 2 mid-level mages, and another lower-end mage, all on the higher end of the Kinelovia scale, meant that whatever the regional head of the Magical Incident Investigation Agency had found, or been told had happened in this backwater, was concerning. "What do you suspect happened here?" Baknov asked as our group of 4 began to move through the street towards what Roderick had said was a nice-looking restaurant. It could be anything from the mass killing of a couple of mid-level casters by a mage gone mad to on the higher end, and on the run or yet of unknown level 10 fundamental, Paula answered. The latter option sounded scary, a level 10 weaver, especially of a fundamental like temperature, gravity or kinetic, would take a serious fight to take down. "That sounds unpleasant," I stated bluntly, and the others nodded in agreement as we sat down on one of the empty tables. "Yeah, but unfortunately, he hasn't given me any other pieces of information. He just said he would contact me once I got here, but I've gotten nothing from him." I went to the MRO down the road, but they had nothing for me. I asked around if anyone had talked to him, and all I got were suspicious looks and a classic disposition towards authority. It is frustrating me to no extent how we've just been dropped off here to do nothing because we know nothing. I mean, for fuck's sake, we can't even leave the fucking town because it's such a backwater that they only have a few older model cars. Paula grew increasingly angry over her rant before slamming the table, much to the alarm of a nearby waiter. Eventually, after a long silence, Baknov ordered us meals while we figured out what we were meant to do now. After the meal, without communication from the regional head of the MIA, should we just wait for the boss? I mean, seriously, we've been here for 3 or maybe 4 hours now, and nothing has changed about our situation. Roderick sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. If he's not here now, then he won't become, and even if he did come, he would be a what level weaver did you say he was, Paula? Baknov asked. 20, close to breaking into Kinelovia scale level 2, Paula answered with a grunt. Exactly. Suppose the head of the agency for the region did show up. In that case, which means some serious shit has gone down in or around this town that I sure might end up with one of us dead, Baknov argued. Last time I remember the boss getting involved directly with anything was the Dutch Milan triplets, and that resulted in one town being wiped off the empirical census and another so severely damaged that it was better to abandon the place. Paula raised a glass of dark red wine to her lips and let the drink flow down her throat. If he does show up, I'd suspect he wouldn't show up alone. Take the Dutch Malin affair, for example. Every weaver that the regional MIA could acquire was present for the showdown and a dozen or so high-level mages. As Paula finished her sentence, another train pulled into the town station, and the bustle of a dozen or so people getting on and off could be surmised as what counted for peak hour traffic in this town. As the others discussed the implications of what we were dealing with, I gazed out at the platform. Coming down the steps was a tall, slender man with glasses that spectacled even from my distant viewing distance. Even from here, though, I could tell the man exuded power. Not in Paula's stern, almost aggressive manner. No, he wore his power like royalty does. He knew he was powerful and that nothing around him could hurt him. As he strode across the street, that fact became even more evident. The man seemed to glide across the street at the pace of a run, but seemed to only by casually walking. I knew if pushed, he could easily outrun a car. That could mean that he could only be one person. I think our boss is here, I whispered, yelling at the group. Everyone immediately stopped our conversation, gaunt looks on their faces. Where? Paula asked quickly. At the MRO, I said, and in a moment, the 4 of us were running down the street for the magical registry. The door opened as we arrived at the building, and the man stepped out. Good. The 4 of you have arrived, but we must get going now. The train from Uthuri was all right, but the place we're going to is still a 30-minute gorse ride from here, the boss said matter-of-fact as he strode by us. Yes, Mr. DuPont, Paula said with a slight bow on her head. Wait, gorse riding? I asked, miffed about why we rode the beasts when we had cars that could go faster over longer distances. Yes, Mrs. Fishclaw, the roads in this part of the empire are not that well developed outside of towns like this, so we'll hire some gorse and ride to the farmstead that is our destination." Mr. DuPont remained calm as he walked off to a building a couple 100 feet down the road. Paula quickly followed him while Baknov and I waited a little longer to settle our emotions before following our boss down the road. Once we got to our destination and hired our gorse, we set off to leave town. The picturesque rolling hills of the Rune Valley made the journey beautiful. Small farmsteads and boxen stations dotted the sides and peaks of some hills, while the dams rested in the low points near the dirt, a gravel road that stretched the definition of a road. After around 30 minutes, the trees and hills becoming monotonous to my eyes, Mr. DuPont stopped in the middle of the road and held up his hand for the rest of us to stop. "The next farmstead entrance is the one. I want you all on the good lookout." The request came off more as a command or order than I suspected DuPont wanted, as the entire group, including Paula, stiffened their backs and tried to hold their heads higher than needed to look out for danger. As the group got moving again, we got slower. The approach to the entrance of the farmstead was a walk, as we all reined in our gorse. "I'll lead," DuPont commanded as he descended the trail towards a hill. A hill that, now that I look at it, looked to have been the site of a mighty battle, as whatever farmstead sat on it seemed to be destroyed. Some parts of the original building seemed to remain, but most walls and even the chimney lay scattered across the hill face as if an explosion sent by the gods smote that particular farmer. However, as our group approached, the damage only worsened. The bodies of dead monsters lay scattered, visible holes shot into them, or limbs broken by whatever took place around this farmstead. The ground was pockmarked with craters and cracks, like the earth itself was bruised from the altercation that took place there. "I can see why you wanted to come along now," Paula said quietly as she observed a dead dire hawk. "This isn't half of it," DuPont said weakly as he approached the main building. Hopping off his gorse DuPont, he walked towards the shattered remains of the main homestead. The rest of the group followed. "There are at least a couple dozen monsters here. But this house isn't even near the forest. So what gives? How do we find ourselves in the midst of what looked to be a war zone?" Baknov asked as he kicked the corpse of a giant werewolf that would have stood around 5 meters tall. The werewolf seemed to have had its head carved in by something even bigger by the looks of the dent creature's skull. "One man did all of this," DuPont said quietly as he contemplated the actual dead 6-meter-tall giant that had its chest pushed in violently and was currently resting in what was the basement of the house. The rest of the group seemed to become quiet for a moment before I let out a squeak. "What?" I asked, hoping to have misheard the man in front of me. "I guess now that you're seeing the damage he caused, I think it's about time I explain why I came along to the middle of bumfuck nowhere to examine a random magical crime scene alongside a low-level weaver and 3 mages." DuPont sighed as he stepped down from the floor of the house to face the 4 of us. "I would exactly call this just some random crime scene, DuPont. It's a fucking war zone," Roderick chided as he gave a superficial glance at the enormous werewolf just a couple meters away from us. "Well, when things happen this far into the rural parts of society, they tend to get ignored by the greater bureaucracies of the cities. Well, at least they did until the advent of our current travel technologies. Before the car and train, it would have taken weeks, even months, before the words of this battle would reach the MIA, and by then, the story is so muddy that the event's exact location would be unable to be found, let alone what town the event occurred in. However, in our modern world, words have reached my ear only 2 days after what you saw in front of you happened. It only took until the next day to get some investigators out here to legitimize the scene and gather eyewitness testimony. From there, it only took another 2 days to get the people needed to this middle-of-nowhere location. We are those needed people, meaning that this battle took place almost 5 days ago." DuPont motioned to the dead monsters around them before continuing. "As I was saying, this was all caused by one man. His level is unknown, but he's almost certainly a kinetic weaver of some level. The sheer utterance of the words kinetic and weaver is enough to send the whole group into a nervous jitter." From the report, the man came running out of the nearest monster forest about 5 kilometers, followed by a veritable army of monsters and magical beasts. Both air and land seemed to be attacking him, and he was attacking them. The trail of destruction destroyed 5 farmsteads like this before he came here with the remnant of the army. Eyewitnesses only reported the monsters big enough to be visible from neighboring farmsteads. There was the giant and werewolf and a constrictor, which, if the reports are anything to go by, probably remains cut in half by the remains of the barn. Again, DuPont motioned to the shattered wooden barn that stood a good 100 meters from the group. Anyways, those monsters were probably the weakest of what followed him out of the forest again from the report. He was followed by a corpse stork, a hawk matriarch, a moon owl, a living conifer, and a giant forest troll that could have also been a rock troll. Depending on the description, with each new horror that DuPont described, the man as having killed by himself, the faces of the group dropped lower and lower. "What level do you think he is, sir?" Paula asked if the color tried to return to her skin. After the hundreds of monsters and the magical beasts he slayed plus the several wild horror-tier beasts that he killed, I'd guess above 10, but it also depends on where he sat before he caught the eye of an entire forest. If he had just become a weaver, he could be sitting between levels 11 and 14. Still, suppose he was an experienced Kentic weaver who went in looking for a level boost without much care for the world around him. In that case, he could be sitting around level 21 by now, which would make him either very close to gaining a KSL of 2 or already gave him that distinction. DuPont seemed to pause for a moment before frowning as the rest of the group let the information sink in. Though that also depends on him not killing even more wild horrors or higher tier beasts in the forest itself, adding on whatever things the witnesses didn't see. To answer your question, Paula, he's no less than 10, no more than 30. Paula let out a little yip at that, and Baknov seemed close to fainting. Isn't everyone with a KSL of 3 and higher listed by the Empire? I asked, trying to find my voice in my now throat. Yes, Paula and DuPont said, though Paula uttered her response much weaker than our boss. We need to find this man, don't we? I asked, afraid to even say anything. Yes, though we should search this farmstead here first, as none of the neighbors reported anyone leaving the property after the battle, so we might only have to do a little more search. The promise of a quick search seemed to raise the group's spirits into a movable state instead of the catatonic one it was before the declaration. As everyone began to scatter for their searches, I approached DuPont, fiddling with my fingers. "Mr. DuPont, why didn't the investigators you sent find him?" My question came out as a meek purr, which Mr. DuPont laughed at. "You see, Mrs. Fishclaw, those men took one look at the graveyard of monsters and the devastation of the house and hightailed it out of this place as soon as possible. Heck, they didn't even see the giant or the werewolf. Just a couple of dire eagles, and that was enough to scare the shit out of them." DuPont laughed as I began my search in earnest. The entire estate seemed like some freak storm had ravished it. But it wasn't until I got on top of what I thought was once a wooden grain silo that the sheer scale of the destruction became evident. A sea of monster corpses was off into the rolling hills north of the estate. Hundreds, nay thousands, of dead monsters of all sizes stretched on into the distance. I even spotted a few wild horrors, like a living rock formation and an enormous magic amalgamation that looked the size of a manor on the hill of a neighboring farmstead. Hopping off the silo, I continued to search the farmstead. Every monster had been killed using some form of blunt force trauma, which made sense given that DuPont said the man was a kinetic weaver. Finally, I searched the remains of what I assumed was a cold storage barrow, given the air still seemed frost compared to the spring air outside. The lights of the place flickered as they tried to turn on. The sight between those flickers was ghastly. It seemed that there was one final wild horror-tier creature on this hill that DuPont witnesses hadn't spotted, and its corpse lay in this meat freezer. The unsettling corpse of the spider matriarch lay scattered across the dungeon-like environment. Its legs seemed to have been individually torn off, and its large cations carapaces split open, the size of the numerous dents. When the lights finally decided to stay on, I spotted the corpse. No, his chest was moving. Shit, he was still breathing. My eyes flared as I realized the man was still alive in here, and my legs carried me out of the hovel. "Found him!" I screamed, hoping my voice went far enough for everyone to hear. When only DuPont sped around the corner off the silos like a race car, I moved every piece of grass within 10 meters of the estate towards my direction, hoping that could get everyone's attention. While I did that, DuPont yelled out my find, and his voice seemed to carry like the wind to such an extent that I suspected the neighbor would have been able to hear it as he yelled it into their ear. Our combination worked as, in short order, the rest of the group raced from where they were on the farmstead ground to the underground meat freeze. As we walked down, DuPont turned his head in a random direction and exclaimed, "The runes still work on this thing?" before muttering under his breath, "Fucking farmers." As we got to the bottom of the stairs, however, everyone seemed quiet as they all spotted the still-breathing man lying on a stack of meat. The man was short, shorter than even me. Most people in the Kwang Empire, including women, reached over 2 meters in height, but this man seemed closer to 1.90 than to 2 flats. The man wore a clean-shaven face, which wasn't rare, but most men liked letting it grow out a little, like DuPont and Roderick. His dark black hair was not unusual, but meant that he most likely came from the Untare Caliphate. However, the man's pale skin made him look much more Quangian. But neither would explain her stature. Maybe the untied tribes of the Ice Phoenix might. I had heard stories that those people got as short as 1.8 meters. None of that was as strange as the man's tattered clothing. Though destroyed and shredded, the man's pants and shirt seemed to be in remarkable condition for the battle he had just gone through. The strangest part, however, was what the clothing was made of. The fabric seemed to be made out of some textile that looked like a mixture of wool, silk, and some other fabric that formed a strange textile. As the group got closer and examined the man and noted down the hundreds of minor cuts, scrapes, and bruises that bisected his body, they also tried to fix any significant cuts, with Roderick, being a flame mage, being able to cauterize most of the largest gashes and cuts on the man's body. Once happy that the unknown kinetic weaver wouldn't die while trying to get him back to civilian, the group began to discuss what they wanted to do with him. "He's odd, Roderick. Just fucking odd. He has traits from at least 5 different national heritages, and that doesn't include the dozen that I've never seen, like blue eyes and his broken-looking thumb," Baknov exclaimed, pointing at the features. "Wait, you're telling me his thumb isn't broken?" Roderick asked, eyeing the odd angle that happened after the first joint next to the nail. "It's perfectly fine. You can tell because both his thumbs look like that," Roderick stated. "What do you suspect he is, then? Elf, fae, dwarf?" I asked. "No one in particular. He's far short to be an elf. They average above 2.15 meters. He'd be considered a midget by them. Meanwhile, dwarves and fae are found on other continents, but parts of him disprove both, like his shaved features, which no dwarf would ever even think of after they get coarse facial hair. Meanwhile, his eyelashes and arms are far too short to be fair," DuPont pointed out, like he had seen the races mentioned personally, which he probably had considering his position. The group sighed collectively, and DuPont disproved each of their theories on man's origins. Eventually, Roderick had had enough of the talk and huffed before shouting, "Why don't we just take him to the transition and get him back to his city so we can at least do some science bullshit on him?" At the man's explosion of emotion, the unconscious kinetic weaver let out a simple, pained grunt that transformed into a few words as he began to wake up. "Shut the fuck and let me sleep."